Welcome back to another impactful episode of the PSTA podcast. It is Craig King, your favorite host, and we're preparing for a winter storm that may or may not happen. And based on South Carolina weather, Patrick, I anticipate nothing.
Yeah, so what I've decided is that the most effective lobbyist in South Carolina is whoever lobbies for the dairy farmers, because they are working the meteorologists of this state. Like there's lobbying here, or this is some sort of massive corruption of kickbacks from dairy farmers to meteorologists. But I mean, God bless them, because we're going to sell some milk over the next 24 hours.
Yeah, let's do it, because the eggs are gone in the store. I was in the store yesterday. All the eggs are gone.
Yeah.
The bread seemed to still be on the shelves, but we'll see.
For now.
But yeah, we're back for a brand new legislative session, the first of two parts, correct?
Yeah. Year one.
And we're excited about what's to come, and we've already had a lot of excitement, usually not really taking place at the beginning like this, Patrick. So
yeah.
The Voucher Bill.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's surreal. So we're a week down. The first week is gone. And so this has kind of been like, if you've ever been in a big city and the traffic light finally turns green and you gun it to try to get to the next intersection, and right before you get to the intersection, the red light comes on and you slam the brakes. That's the feeling for education policy, because the Senate came flying out of the gate last week with a voucher bill. Or education scholarship account bill. I'm going to use the correct terminology.
Use the correct term. Yeah.
And it came straight to the floor. They started debating it. They amended it. And now the Senate's out of session this week. The House is out of session. They are in perfunctory session, which means that bills can be read across the desk, but they're not actually physically here. And now that the weather is what it is, that appears to have probably been a convenient alignment of calendar anyway. But S62 is the new education scholarship account bill, and it's in some ways Groundhog Day in terms of Bill Murray's movie. It feels like I've lived this day before, but in some ways this bill is fundamentally different than what we've seen in the past.
Okay, so I think it's something that for our advocates out there that pay attention to how policy usually works. And you alluded to it a little bit, but talk about how this is typically different in how legislation kind of starts. So talk about the need from the Senate to feel the need to kind of move faster with this.
Yeah, I mean, typically a bill is going to be heard in a subcommittee where public testimony is taken. Mm-hmm. Then it's going to go to the full committee and get debated and amended and voted on and reported to the Senate. With this bill, on literally the first day of session, the Senate Education Chair, Greg Hembry, pulled the bill out of committee, POLL. Mm-hmm. That's a completely valid rule under Senate rules. So this isn't something nefarious. This is not normal, but it is completely allowable. And so basically he took a poll of the Education Committee members, and they overwhelmingly voted to go ahead and send the bill straight to the floor for debate without a formal committee meeting and committee vote. And the reason why is Senator Hembry, as he articulated on the first day of debate when he was explaining the bill and answering questions, is he repeatedly referred to it as an urgent need to get this legislation passed, because there are families in limbo in South Carolina that started the school year with an education scholarship account that was signed into law in 2023. They received funding from the state. And according to Senator Hembry, about 700 of those families were using that money to pay for private school tuition. Well, in the fall, the state Supreme Court invalidated the ability to use an education scholarship account for private school tuition because, in the court's view, the majority of the court's view, it is a use of public funds for the direct benefit of a private school. Article 11, Section 4 of the state constitution expressly prohibits that. Mm-hmm. And so the court struck down the ability to use ESA dollars for private school tuition. You could use it for other things, and there are over 1,000 families using it for other things. But those 700-ish, according to Senator Hembry, are now in a scenario where in the middle of the school year, they've enrolled their child in a private school. At the start of the year, they thought they'd have funding from the state to pay the private school tuition. And now the state can no longer allow that money to be used for private school tuition. And so that Senator Hembry said there's an urgent need to address that status for families.
Well, thank you for the explanation, because I know all of our history buffs out there and those that are tied whether it's their work or their interest to policy and government, wanted to know kind of what was happening with that. But let's transition to Governor McMaster's executive budget, which I know was recently released. And what are some things in there that we need to kind of keep eyes on?
So in the K-12 space, he made a couple of recommendations. The highlight and the biggest one that people should keep their eye on, and that I know people are interested in, is he is proposing, the same as Superintendent Weaver, to have the General Assembly fund $200 million additional dollars in state aid to classrooms, so $200 million increase over last year, in order to fund a $3,000 pay raise to every cell on the statewide minimum teacher salary schedule. And so a couple things just to clarify. And we tried to clarify this in the Legislative Alert Network, but it can't be said enough. Just to be clear, he is proposing maintaining all 5 lanes in the salary schedule. Last year, he had proposed going from 5 lanes to 2. This year, he's still at all 5. Last year, the General Assembly funded a pay raise for every teacher on the statewide minimum salary schedule, but different cells went up by different amounts. Some cells went up by as much as $5,000. Some went up by as little as a few $100s. Mm-hmm. The governor is proposing $3,000 to every cell on the statewide schedule. And I keep saying the statewide schedule because what that would do is raise statewide minimum teacher pay to $50,000. Of course, right now it's $47,000. And it would raise every cell step 0 through 28 accordingly on the statewide schedule. But what people need to remember is that most districts already pay beyond the statewide schedule, and a few already pay beyond the $50,000 starting salary the governor's proposing. So in those districts, the governor's proposal would not require them to do anything. And some districts pay beyond step 28. Well, the state does not. The state stops at step 28. Right. So it's not as easy as just saying it's a $3,000 raise for every teacher next year. It's a $3,000 raise to every cell on the statewide schedule. And if your district is beyond the statewide schedule, it'll then be up to your local board to determine what, if any, pay raise a teacher would get. Now, in theory, they're getting funding from the state to raise every step 0 to 28 by $3,000, but that would still be at their discretion.
Yeah, and another, I think I'll add to that, Patrick, understanding that the governor has proposed his executive budget. It's up to the members of the General Assembly to take his recommendations or add to or take from. Mm-hmm. And so while the governor has proposed this executive budget and in many cases gives guidance to members of the General Assembly, it's important for us to know that our House and our Senate members are actually going to draft what the budget is going to look like, and ultimately the governor will have a opportunity to veto or accept what they do. And so that's a very important explanation. So understanding how your local district mm-hmm. pays its teachers is paramount to understanding how this raise will affect you.
And a question I got from one of our members after we sent out the Legislative Alert Network email on Friday is it's also important for people to remember that the state funds the certified teacher salary schedule. Mm-hmm. They do not have a salary schedule for instructional assistants and other classified staff. So the governor's failure to propose a pay raise there is not indicative of those individuals, those educators not getting a salary increase. Those have always been a local determination. Now, PSTA, we've been advocating for the state to provide some dedicated line item in the state budget to support the salaries of instructional assistants. But the governor's proposal does not impact non-certified individuals like an instructional aide or a paraprofessional. It gives more money to districts, and districts in turn have flexibility on how to spend that money as long as they're meeting the statewide minimum schedule. But people should not interpret the governor's failure to make a proposal there to mean that an instructional aide wouldn't get a raise in 25-26. That would be dependent on local board decisions, as it always is. The one other proposal the governor made that is significant, that is worth noting, is he's proposing an additional $30 million to the Education Scholarship Account Fund that still exists, even though the court struck down use for private school tuition. He has to do that by law. Like that is required. The program this year extends from 5,000 eligible scholarships to 10,000 under the existing law. So he's requesting the additional $30 million that would fund it. But this is where S62, the Senate bill, gets interesting, because the Senate bill is seeking to fund that out of the lottery scholarship, because they believe that is the workaround constitutionally to the Supreme Court striking down ESA dollars for private schools. Their theory of action is that lottery scholarships fund, or the lottery account funds scholarships that go to private colleges. I could go to Furman University with a Life or Palmetto Fellow scholarship.
Right.
So the theory of action of Senator Hembry and others that support S62 is that if it's good for higher ed, it's good for K-12. Now, opponents of S62 say, no, it doesn't work that way because Article 11 is about K-12 education, not about higher ed. But regardless, if the Senate passes S62, then budgeting for the lottery account gets really interesting, because now you're injecting a new line item into the lottery system, and S62 also increases the amount of an ESA. Right now it's capped at $6,000 a year. Under S62, it would increase to the state average per pupil expenditure in public schools. This year that's $8,500, but it could be higher. Like, that's a floating number at that point. So whereas the governor's proposing a straight $30 million, because that's 5,000 ESAs at $6,000 each, the price tag could actually be higher depending on what the per pupil allocation is. So S62 is really changing the budgetary, beyond the policy implications. It has different impacts on the budget than the existing policy.
For sure. And we'll make sure that we keep an eye on that and communicate changes as we navigate this legislative session. So before we wrap up, Patrick, is there anything out there outside of what our members have experienced in or seen in our legislative alert network that we should be aware of?
So this is something where I would encourage people to pay attention to Legislative Alert Network. So one thing that we do at PSTA is we try to keep members informed with information that is actionable and has a realistic likelihood of occurring at the State House, because we recognize that South Carolina's educators have fewer hours in the day than they need. And so we don't want to overburden people with a lot of information that's just not relevant and is just a lot of noise. Now, sometimes that's because we know that a bill is coming, but not yet. So some people have reached out and asked about the Educator Assistance Act that Chair Lady Erickson in the House has been pushing for a year and a half. That wasn't in last week's LAN, but it's coming. It's just the House, as we put in last week's LAN, is taking their time getting started this year because the House Education Committee, a third of the members are brand new. So Chair Lady Erickson is bringing in state agencies like the Department of Education, the Department of Transportation, to make presentations to the committee so the members can learn about the agencies that they are legislating for.
Yep.
So she's not moving any bills yet. So the lack of any update on the Educator Assistance Act doesn't mean that it's not going anywhere. Just we're not there yet. There are other bills that are probably not going anywhere. There were over 600 bills pre-filed before the first day of session. And there's probably another 100 that have been filed in the first week of session. There are not enough hours in the day. The South Carolina General Assembly is in session for 18 weeks, 3 days a week for 2 years. If they stayed in session 24 hours a day for all of those, there's literally not enough minutes for them to debate, pass all those bills. So we at PSTA are not going to push out to members a lot of focus on bills that do not appear to be going anywhere. Now, we're not perfect at predicting things. We're not Nostradamus, and if something unexpected comes up, which does from time to time, that's why we send out action alerts or midweek emails to members. But, there's been a lot of talk about bills about live streaming teacher classrooms and things of that nature. Yes, those bills have been filed, but there's no indication that those bills are going anywhere anytime soon. So we're trying to use the limited amount of time that our members have to inform them about what's happening, what's likely to happen, and what they can do to influence policy at the moment. And sometimes, I'm just going to be frank, there's so many bills filed that the members don't know about all these bills. So sometimes if you're reaching out about some fringe bill, you're bringing attention to something that somebody didn't even know existed.
Yep.
So that's what we're trying to keep focused on, is what's happening so that we're using member time effectively and efficiently. and not overburdening people with more info than they need or can use at the moment.
Yeah, and Patrick, you probably don't remember this, but you recently said something while we were at work a few weeks ago, and you talked about how when you see a piece of legislation proposed, what is the intent of it, right? And sometimes the intent is to change policy or change state statute or whatever it may be, but sometimes it's to make a point. It's not necessarily for that idea to become law, because in a lot of cases, the people proposing, the legislators, they know that it's not going to move, but they want to make a point by proposing it. And so it's very important that you pay attention to your land and see what we have kind of laid out, because as Patrick alluded to, we're not perfect in predicting what we think is coming down the line, but there are so many pieces of legislation that are not going to move. And since we know that, and we know your time is precious, we're not going to inundate you with all this information about something based on our years of experience is probably not going to come down the line.
The only thing I'd tag to that is, if somebody's got a question,
sure,
reach out. We're always happy to answer questions. And I don't want to oversell this and diminish the importance of a bill being introduced. A bill being introduced is a significant part of our governmental process, because that bill could eventually become law. Yeah. So does a bill that's filed matter? Of course it does. But we're going to put our biggest attention on the bills with the greatest likelihood of being heard, because those are the places where advocates can make the biggest impact. But if you see a bill, you hear about it, you got a question, call the PSTA office, send us an email, and we will gladly assist with that.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll say is appreciate the process of these newly elected representatives and senators, in particular the representatives, because we're talking about the House. Appreciate the deliberateness. I just made up a word.
That's a good word.
Yeah,
I like it.
I just made that word up. I'm a teacher, but I can make up words. But appreciate the process of these new members learning about these agencies, as opposed to coming in on day one and voting on something like the Educator Assistance Act that we support, but not having a full understanding of the impacts and the agencies that are going to implement this thing. Appreciate that part of it as well. And I know last year there was a ton of interest from our members and teachers and the educational community at large in support of that piece of legislation. So thank you for breaking that down for us, Patrick.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. So now we can all just get ready for championship weekend in the NFL and the snow. We'll be ready.
Yeah. That was a plug for the Buffalo Bills. He's not going to say it, but his team is in the AFC Championship. I think Josh Allen is like 4-1 against Patrick Mahomes in the regular season.
Yeah, but we don't talk about the playoffs.
But the playoffs, they matter, Patrick. We're not going to give that record. I won't do that to my friend.
It's 0-3.
But I am pulling for Josh Allen and the Bills this weekend. I want to make that publicly known. I am pulling.
Bills Mafia. There's always a folding table you can jump through. Come get on the bandwagon.
All right. This has been another impactful episode of the PSTA podcast. I'm Craig King, your host. We'll see you next time.